Hello and welcome to the U.S. Center. My name is Amanda McCarty. I work for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and I'd like to welcome you to our event today. The U.S. Center is a public diplomatic outreach space sponsored by the U.S. Department of State. We highlight great work being done by agencies and partners in the U.S. and around the world. I'd like to especially welcome our online viewers and encourage you to participate actively in the program. Please send us any questions via hashtag AskUSCenter towards the end of the presentation, and we will try to work you into the conversation. With that, I would like to welcome all the people in the audience as well. We have a fantastic program today focusing on promoting the central role of women in clean energy entrepreneurship. I'd like to introduce our facilitator for the day, Dr. Linda Davis. Dr. Davis serves as the Director of Partnerships at wPOWER Hub, where she directs efforts to build a global partnerships promoting the central role that women must play in leading the adoption of clean cooking and lighting technologies to address both energy poverty and climate change. Dr. Davis has worked 10 years in the biotech industry in San Diego, California, and approximately 1 year ago moved to Kenya. And she will be telling you about some of the work that she's taken on most recently. So, Dr. Davis, I'd like to welcome you to the stage.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you all for coming to mark the expansion of the Partnership of the Women's Entrepreneurship in Renewables. That's wPOWER. We have a tremendous panel. Thank you all for being here. Without further ado, let's get straight into it. The goal of the next hour is to examine how key stakeholders can leverage partnerships and their own organizations to promote the role that women must play in eradicating energy poverty, specifically by promoting clean cooking, lighting, and heating technologies. So here's how we're going to go about the next hour. I'll start by introducing the panelists, then provide a very brief introduction about wPOWER, and then I'll have the very great honor of inviting our special guest, Ambassador Dwight L. Bush, who is the U.S. ambassador to Morocco, to make some brief remarks. I'll get back on stage and kick off the panel discussion after I make very few introductory remarks to further set perspective and context about the issue of clean energy at the household level. Our panelists are, starting with the one closest to me, is Wanjiru Mathai, who's the director of the wPOWER Hub, the organization with whom I'm associated. Next to her is Dr. Juliet Biayo, who is a director and regional representative for UNEP. Next to her is Bridget Burns. She is a director for advocacy and communications at Women's Environment and Development Organization, We Do. And finally, last but not least, we have Rudy Garcia, who is the director of communications at wPOWER. Thank you again, panelists, for being with us. So just a quick Power Africa, what did I say? At Power Africa. Thank you. All right. So the wPOWER initiative was launched in 2013 by the U.S. State Department with the aim of unlocking women's potential to address climate change by empowering women entrepreneurs to deliver clean energy access in hard-to-reach communities around the world. Our mission at wPOWER Hub is to promote the central role that women must play in clean energy access and in addressing climate change. With those brief remarks, I'd like to introduce our special guest, the U.S. Ambassador to the Kingdom of Morocco, Dwight L. Bush, Sr. Ambassador Bush assumed his post to the US as the U.S. Ambassador in March 2014. Prior to that, Ambassador Bush had a distinguished career as a financial and corporate executive beginning in 1975. Concurrent with his professional career, Ambassador Bush has engaged in various philanthropic, civic, education institutional board directorships, including Cornell University, Xavier University, Louisiana, the Gavi Alliance, the Joint Centers for Social and Economic Studies, and the National Symphony Orchestra. Welcome, Ambassador Bush.
Thank you, Linda. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my honor to be here to welcome you to the U.S. Center at COP-22. And I'm particularly pleased to be a part of this discussion today on promoting the central role of women in clean energy entrepreneurship. As Linda suggested, I do have a background as an entrepreneur, and indeed we've spent a lot of time at the embassy encouraging entrepreneurship. And I'm especially keen to be involved in a get-together like this when we're encouraging women to take a very active role and to have a big voice in addressing the issues related to climate and our environment. And I'm pleased to be with this distinguished group of women today. You remind me of something that my mom told me a long time ago. I come from a family of strong women, and my mom said, when you don't have women at the table, you lose 50% of the population, but you lose 75% of the brain power. And my life has shown time and time again that my mom was very right when she said that, because I see so many women who are thriving, making such extraordinary and important contributions, whether it's in governance or in business or socially, or certainly again in this on this stage, talking about climate and the environment. So as ambassador, when I took the job, they told me that you will tend towards the things that you know and you like. And indeed, it's been no different for me. We have a full portfolio of things that we work with on the Moroccans on, everything from countering violent extremism to terrorism to, we have a free trade agreement, we're encouraging education, encouraging the development of civil society, but we focus a lot on entrepreneurship, because what we know is entrepreneurs who develop the ideas, who have the spirit, who have the passion to create and do great things. And again, in this space, there's nothing more important than to have that creativity at the table all the time, and having to make sure that women have the appropriate voice in this endeavor. So why is this important? Well, we know that globally, an estimated 1.3 billion people do not have access to reliable, affordable energy, and they rely on inefficient lighting, cooking, and heating methods. These practices contribute to climate change through increased carbon emissions and degradation of natural resources, which, according to the WHO, contributes to the death of nearly 4 million people annually from respiratory illnesses alone. And of course, unfortunately, women are disproportionately affected by this. But despite the attention this issue has received over the last few decades, women are largely excluded from the clean energy conversation. This is unfortunate because evidence shows that empowering women economically in developing countries not only increases clean energy use in households, but also benefits their families and the communities in which they live. And that's because women typically reinvest 90% of their income in these social structures, compared to a rate of just 30 to 40% by men. Entrepreneurship provides women with a path to economic empowerment and a means to be a critical force for sustainability, managing natural resources, and increasing clean energy access. It can help put women, including some of the world's most disadvantaged women, on the front lines in combating climate change. Specifically, women have a critical role to play in the development of emerging markets for clean energy solutions. From the design of technology to innovative distribution methods to awareness raising and spurring the new technologies adaptation, women at every level of society must be involved in every aspect of this most important value chain. Partnerships such as wPOWER that are bringing together key players within the sector are crucial platforms to help spur growth. wPOWER is providing one-stop shopping access to resources such as best practices and data from research that makes the compelling case that having women playing a central role across the value chain makes sense and is important to all of us. I hope that through this event this afternoon, you will learn more about the work of wPOWER and join the partnership to accelerate the adaptation of lasting and scalable solutions to this most important problem. Thank you all, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador, for those very kind remarks and very, very important remarks. So to set the stage before we begin the conversation with the panelists, I'd like to run through just iterating why this issue is important to me. It's very personal, actually. This is a picture of my village in Tanzania, and it's a picture taken very, very recently, actually. These are the huts where my mother grew up and where many of my aunties and many of my cousins live. Call it survivor guilt, but after completing my PhD in Australia in 2005, and with proceeds from my first few months' salary, I built the stone house you see on the left. But more importantly, I connected that house and the surrounding huts to the grid. And ours was among the first houses in that village to switch on the lights. And it was indeed a very great day for me to give back to my community in such a real way. My motivations were definitely self-serving, to assuage the guilt of having received so much opportunity while my extended family literally remained in the dark. That's a house that I built. Not a very fancy house, but certainly a little bit of an improvement. I'm especially proud of the opportunities that my nieces and nephews have now received, and many are attending university because they are grid connected. However, 1.3 billion people, as the ambassador noted, still lack access to electricity. And 600,000 of those are in Africa, where I'm from. And as many as 2.7 billion people rely on biomass fuel for their primary cooking needs. This is one of my aunties in the village. This is not a stock photo, and I took this picture in 2003. And I wasn't clued on to the issues of cooking. I only really did come to appreciate the severity of this issue in the last 2 years. So this would have been my reality, and I have spent several hours cooking on a cook stove like this. But more importantly, cooking like this causes almost 600 deaths a year, almost 4 million deaths globally, and 600,000 in sub-Saharan Africa. I solved for lighting when I connected the village to the grid, but cooking methods in my village, in my town, and certainly in the city where I live, which is Nairobi, Kenya, are still reliant on cooking on charcoal and firewood. Not much has changed. So therefore, it is from this perspective that I am persuaded, and as wPOWER, we are persuaded that it is critical that household-scale cooking and lighting technologies achieve a dominant position in the energy marketplace, even as we focus on large-scale projects such as wind, photovoltaic, thermal solar, tidal, and wave power. So as we develop those large-scale projects, we need to have the household energy level at the forefront. As the ambassador mentioned, 4.3 million people, primarily women and children, die from the simple act of cooking. This needs to change. Sadly, children are also affected. Sorry, this is a picture of my village again, and this was taken earlier this year, at a funeral. On the left, that's myself with the auntie, whose picture I showed you earlier. And then these are relatives that have come for a funeral, and this is how we're still cooking in 2016, in contrast to my lovely house in Nairobi, Kenya, where I cook with gas. So this issue is very, 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 very true for me. And it's a shame and it's a pity that not much has changed in terms of scale in the last few decades. My colleague Wanjira tells a story of her mother's friend who's now 90, And she talks about working on the issue of cooking from the early 60s. And yet 80% of our population still relies on biomass and inefficient cooking technologies for their daily survival. Sadly, children are also affected, either from being in a kitchen as young children or taking care of the cooking responsibilities themselves as they get older. More to the topic of this event, affecting you and I and the Earth collectively, is the fact that 25% of climate-changing black carbon is a result of burning biomass for cooking. We at wPOWER and the organizations represented by the panelists here and a number of stakeholders see the opportunity for women who are not just victims. Women can be powerful agents for tremendous change, so we at the Hub are engaged in priorities that make that case. And these are our priorities, and we'll talk more about them. We build evidence, we share best practices, and we advocate. And by doing that, we hope we can actually scale and solve the problem of inefficient cooking once and for all. Thank you very much. Okay. All right, I'd like to turn it over to our panelists. And I'd like to start by asking the same question of all four, and this is simply to introduce your organizations with a little bit more detail, make some remarks about the things you're most excited about, especially with the issue of gender in the clean cooking arena. 3 or 5 minutes would be great.
Great, thank you, Linda. Fortunately, you introduced my organization, so I don't really have to. Can you hear me? They told me to keep talking, and apparently it will happen. Does that seem to have happened? Lovely. So Linda introduced the Partnership for Women's Entrepreneurship in Renewables. And I just want to highlight, perhaps not to repeat what Linda said, that the interest in wPOWER is really to catalyze this transformation, ending energy poverty, by investing in women. There's a fundamental belief and understanding, there's evidence out there, perhaps not enough, that suggests that investing in women would not only hasten the achievement of energy security, but that we could actually see multiple co-benefits. Because we know, for example, from the clean cooking movement, the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves, says that if we address the issue of clean cooking, it addresses 10 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And so the additive benefits of investing in women is undeniable. So for us at wPOWER, this is a strategic imperative. It is not par We are investing in the potential for women to transform, both through entrepreneurship, but also as agents of change in addressing climate change.
Thank you very much. I will not repeat what you said. I'm from I work at the United Nations Environment Program. In addition to what Wanjira has just said, in our organization, we believe that investing in women is really trying to respond to the human rights. And I will talk about it in my presentation, because human rights we need really to to help all citizens to meet the basic need, and also to extend to all the opportunities to fulfill the aspiration to live in dignity. And investing in women, promoting women entrepreneurship in clean energies is also part of this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As was said, I'm Bridget Burns, the co-director of the Women's Environment and Development Organization, and also really privileged to be the focal point of the Women and Gender constituency in this space. We do celebrating 25 years of existence this year, and we were founded by many amazing women, and it was to really ensure that women's rights, women's perspectives, and women's voices were included in policy processes and decision making around environment. Because for us, this is a women's human rights issues, and all issues are women's issues. And so the advocacy that we do, and that we do in this climate change space, is to really make sure that the realities, which you've so articulated, Linda, in your presentation, the realities around the world of who's being left behind, who has access to energy, who has the rights to control and ownership of resources, is effectively integrated into how we're developing and designing these policies. And that happens at multiple levels in terms of ensuring we integrate language into these decisions and mechanisms, but also that we're designing, technology assessments and transfer opportunities in a way that responds to the needs of both women and men equally. So I'm incredibly pleased to be here with you to talk about how we ensure that as we try to meet the goals of Paris, that no one gets left behind.
Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Linda and Wanjira, for inviting me. My name is Rudy Garcia. I work for Power Africa, President Obama's Energy Access Initiative. And I'll tell you a little bit about how Power Africa started, and I think it's one of my favorite stories. Power Africa was launched on President Obama's first trip to Africa. He went to 3 countries. He went to Senegal, he went to South Africa, and he went to Tanzania. And I worked in our press shop in Washington, and the plan was that he was supposed to launch Power Africa in the 3rd country, right, Tanzania. So he gets to the 2nd country, and he launches it. And imagine a press director's nightmare when, like, this initiative is launched, like, 5 days early, right? So we're all scrambling to get everything up and posted. But what we realize is that he's actually super excited about Power Africa. And what we realized that we were just as excited about it, and we somehow brought together 14 partners and found $7 billion to advance access to electricity in sub-Saharan Africa. But what we were most surprised by was that the world was actually really excited also. Today we've got 130 private sector partners. Awesome timing. 12 U.S. government agencies partnered with us, and 10 multi and bilateral partners joining this initiative. And as part of my role as a communications director, it's to kind of work with some of these new partners as they onboard and do a lot of these kind of launch events. We did one today with the government of France. We just welcomed them into the partnership. And what we found with all of these letters of intent and these memorandums for understanding is that people want to focus on 2 things. They want to commit their money and their time and their resources, and they want to do it well, and they want to focus on renewable energy, and they want to focus on gender. And we see that time and time again. So I'm excited that we're working on this effort and that the world is actually paying attention to it. I think, a lot of what Ambassador Bush and what Linda have said are obviously the same things I would say. The other thing I would add is that energy is the gateway for development. So whether it's schools or hospitals or clinics or trade, business, it all really relies on energy access, and a lot of the work that we do really does target women.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. That's very enlightening. I'd like to start the discussion off with Dr. Biao. You've worked, obviously UNEP is a large coalition. You work with partners to achieve the goals of the organization. Could you speak a little bit to the connections you find between putting women at the forefront of providing access to renewable energies while at the same time fighting climate change?
Thank you very much, Linda. First of all, I would like to put promoting women's entrepreneurship in renewable energy in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. Mm-hmm. And also maybe to highlight what is the opportunity that the 2030 agenda provide. And then I will secondly try to outline some of the key constraints to the promoting of women's rights entrepreneurship. And finally, I would suggest some key transformative efforts as a discrete objective to really promote women's entrepreneurship in renewable energy. As you may know, the 2030 Agenda is a new global development framework with 17 goals, around 17 goals with a total of 169 targets covering economic, social development, and environmental protection. SDGs are core of this new global development framework. The universal nature of the 2030 Agenda will certainly provide an opportunity for engagement and the new types of partnership to address global challenges. We also know that the 2030 Agenda announces a plan of action for people, planet, and prosperity. And it also highlights the universal peace in a larger freedom. And it recognizes also eradicating poverty in all forms and dimensions. If we put promoting women's entrepreneurship in this context, we will really better understand that it is about social justice, it's about human rights. As a matter of fact, women's and primary household energy manager, and they have personal interaction with other members of for the communities, and they have a comparative advantage in serving and also in serving customers better than men do. And yet, women have really a patterns of poor business development. Why is that? And this lead me to the answer to the question will lead me to highlight some of the main constraints. And I will refer with the 2016 finding of Glamaric and al., who reported that the market transformation efforts that really that intend to change the policies and also to reduce the risk on women, the risk do not really benefit to men and women equally. And it's also found that this is because of existing barriers, structural barriers that really need to be addressed. The most significant barriers is obviously across the developing countries, and in particular in Africa, is about ownership and ownership and control on land, which is a precondition for women to finance and access to other productive assets. A lack of access and control on land will really hinder women entrepreneurs in renewable energy to develop initiatives on renewable energy, such as wind turbines and also biofuel production. I think understanding all these barriers in all their dimensions will really help us to promote women entrepreneurship on renewable energy. And in terms of transformation effort that I will suggest, I think the first one is to really involve women in planning and policy formulation, and also conduct access and audit of gender-specific risk and underlying barrier which will require to determine the needs and potential impact on energy plans and policies. It is also important to transform women entrepreneurship specific needs into targeted policies to support women's economic empowerment in the decentralized sector, energy sector. There is also a need to coordinate policy making with policies for education, social protection, trade industry, labor, land tenure, reforms, and access to justice to address gender-specific risk. It is also important to consider allocating, the appropriate budget towards implementation of energy plans and policies. And it's important, the monitoring and evaluation of the implementation of these policies are also key. I think I will just stop there.
No,
If
thank you.
there's some question, I can also.
No, thank you very much. Dr. Bell, you've queued it up really, really well for our the next question to Bridget. You can see that you're the next person to speak. And the reason why Bridget is excited is because she works, centrally in the issue of empowering women. So the question I was going to ask you, Bridget, is what is the strongest evidence, building on what Dr. Bell has said, supporting the case that having women playing a central role in the policies, in planning, as has been outlined, where is that evidence supporting that women, involving women makes good business? And what have you seen in your experience?
So, I really appreciate the comments made before, because I think what's really critical when we're talking about these issues and talking about women's central role in the transition to clean energy is to center it in human rights, and it's to center it in social justice. I think that's a critical aspect of it, and also really being very clear in identifying what some of the issues are in relation to land, in relation to access and rights to and access to justice as well. In the conversations that we have with women in many different countries, these are the issues that really are the extreme barriers to being able to take up opportunities in relation to clean energy in particular. I think that there's multiple different layers of evidence that I've seen shared by numerous colleagues in terms of why it's critically important that both women and men are equally part of the value chain in developing energy systems, as well as part as beneficiaries of clean energy. And those can be just as examples of projects that are developed which don't involve women in the design and the development, whether it's something like solar cookers, which don't take into account the time of day in which most of the community is cooking, for example. We've seen lots of large-scale projects, both development and clean energy related, that have failed simply because they're not developing deep consent and dialogue amongst the community in terms of what their needs are and what their gendered needs are. I think that there is, of course, the example that was given in terms of the rate of return often, that when you invest in women and women entrepreneurs, that they invest back in the system. I'm a bit hesitant to use that as a good example for why we need to invest in women, because I think I think we should be promoting a culture and shifting gender norms so that, and this is my personal kind of challenge with how we need to definitely promote the modalities for ensuring we have women's accessibility to clean energy, and we can promote energy entrepreneurship, but it has to be done within a framing of human rights so that we're not necessarily putting the burden of cleaning up the environment on women. And I think it's something we need to say and discuss, because I have seen projects, for example, where I've been brought into communities and seen projects in local solar collectors where it seemed that there wasn't the added element of how this was an energy generating opportunity for both women and the communities, and that often these were burdens on top of additional burdens that women already had. And so articulating what gender just climate solutions look like, what just and entrepreneurship looks like in relation to clean energy, is something the women and gender constituency have been trying to articulate through sets of principles, like ensuring that that the projects don't add additional burdens to women's already overburdened work, and that programs are also tackling and understanding the power relations that exist within communities that are continual barriers, in addition to the very real legal and accessibility barriers that exist. But I think that, you know, it comes down to the fact that we know that we have this urgent crisis at our hands and an immediate need to shift to a totally new energy systems everywhere. And we don't want to see that shift happen where dirty energy jobs, which are done mainly by men, become clean energy jobs done mainly by men. And we're not shifting either the way that people in communities can access and own and control their resources, or the role that women play in that. And that is not just, you know, in developing countries. In the US, for example, we see the Solar Foundation has put out statistics where even as a huge increase in solar has happened across the US, women, people of color, and veterans even are not accessing those opportunities, that there's a much lower percentage of them being included in the opportunities of a renewable shift in our economies. And so, you know, there's opportunity everywhere to ensure that gender equality and women's rights is a central piece of a transition to a low carbon economy, and that women are given, that the processes we set up take into account the different needs of women and men, and are designed in a way that can counter some of the barriers that have already been addressed at a first point, but that also we're continuing to make sure that we are transforming gender roles and gender power relations as we're making clean energy available to all.
Thank you, Bridget, for those remarks. You know, as you're speaking, I'm thinking there's got to be a role for government, as has been in the United States, with subsidies and a lot of focus in policy and legislation to drive the renewable energy agenda, be it wind, solar, with liquid energy. So I'm curious, Rudy, and this is a question for you, you know, working with Power Africa, you know, what is a key message that you would give to governments around the world, and what role can they play, even as we talk about integrating gender into the energy agenda, given your experience with Power Africa?
Sure. So I think it seems strange to be at an African COP without using an African proverb, right? So I think the one that comes to mind is, if you want to go fast, go alone. And if you want to go far, go together. And I really do believe there is such a huge strength in partnership. And we've learned that with Power Africa, and I've seen that, and I've heard that from our partners. I think, you know, what we've been able to do with Power Africa and what we've seen across the continent is that everyone is working in this space. And a lot of the times people are duplicating their efforts, and a lot of the time people are recreating the wheel, and it's still happening. Even today, we sometimes go to meetings and we find that, you know, we've prepared the same like level of resources, and we've given the same level of activity to doing some mapping exercise or doing some research or some data. So I think that's still happening. So I think making sure that you're coordinated with your partners, making sure that you are working together is a really important thing. I think the other really important thing is to bring women to the discussion. I mean, I am still kind of baffled when I walk into a room and I'm the only woman in there, and I can't understand how we're making decisions about, you know, the energy sector without women. Women are the decision makers, they are the consumers of energy for their households, but oftentimes they're not the designers, they are not the manufacturers, they're not even the sellers. So I think, you know, really bringing them to the table is an important part of it. And you know, another one I think is really important is, you know, bringing men into the gender conversation and ensuring that there are male champions of gender in the room and on these panels and in these discussions, because if there is a room or a table full of just men, I think if we have a gender champion in the room, they'll bring a woman to the table, and I think that's a really important part of it. So making sure that we're bringing you know, both men and women into this conversation, I think, is a really important part of it.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. Rudy, you bring up a very, very important, aspect of partnering together to accelerate, achievement in this particular sector, and that's very, very important. As our name suggests, we are expanding our partnership on, women's in renewables. So I'd like to give Wanjira an opportunity to speak a little bit about, what you see as the opportunities to gain from expanding the partnership in terms of accelerating access in this particular sector.
Thank you. I think Rudy made a really good point about the role of partnerships, but also how important it is for it to be coordinated. I know for sure that the wPOWER partnership would not be a success and will not succeed if we do not have the right partners engaging on a common agenda. The role and the belief in our underlying mission has to be common. So even as we expand, one of the most important things is that we reach out and we engage the right partners who are committed to this cause. One of the most important roles that I'm playing is in advocacy. We have to make sure that people understand the urgency of this issue, and that we can only do by continuing to build the evidence and talk about it. I was heartened, actually, to the point you made, Rudy, about men also getting involved. Very recently, the UN Women launched He for She, and that's a campaign that's recognizing the importance of achieving that agenda by involving multi-stakeholders. So I think there's a lot to be learned from the successful partnerships. And I think for me what's most instructive is what we ought to guard against. We ought to guard against multiple agendas. We ought to guard against asymmetry in arrangements, so that the Secretariat, which is the role that we are playing as wPOWER, provides a sort of support and planning and invests in the support to our partners that makes it easy and worth it for our partners to engage.
Excellent. No, that's very, very helpful. Staying on the subject of partnership, I'm curious to hear from all the panelists, what in your mind are the critical challenges, that a partnership such as this one that is trying to once and for all, for goodness sake, solve this problem. I want to stop feeling guilty every time I visit my relatives because, I've just left my nice gas oven, which I can't bring to the village. What is it? What are the challenges? What can we watch out for going forward? What are the barriers that you anticipate still exist, and how we can address them? So I'm going to have all the panelists speak to that question, and then depending on time, we'll probably throw it out for a few questions. Yeah.
I have the microphone. Shall I go?
Hey, absolutely.
Well, I think I'll just mention one that for me remains the biggest, is how do we scale the work that we're doing to a point that it actually begins to shift the needle? We need to look for models that allow for scale. There's wonderful examples of projects and small-scale work that is going on, but will that be enough? And of course, I'm always inspired by the mobile telephony sector, where for many, many years, it was just too expensive to have a phone. Today, to buy a clean cook stove costs $50. Not many people have $50 when 70% of all the people who live in poverty are women. So not many people will afford a $50 stove. So what will it take for us to get manufacturers and designers to design for extreme affordability? What will it take for us to design, and also for us to advocate and create more value in these technologies so that people feel the need to purchase them? There's a lot of advocacy that needs to happen, but the issue at the moment is scale, so that we can begin to shift the needle in a meaningful way and see this energy poverty come to an end.
Thank you very much, Wanjira. All these are good, but I think the critical issue is about policies, is about the enabling environment. And I think we need to do things differently. We've been talking about the same thing for more than 40 years. and nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. When you take African countries today, my question is, are we really ready to accept that a woman becomes an entrepreneur? What is the enable environment that we are creating for that to happen? What lesson can we learn from the past experiences? Before we jump into new partnerships, scale up, what are we scaling up? On what are we building? I think there is a need to really try to review those policies and see what has not worked and what can we improve. To me, good policies create lasting solution. Until we review all this, nothing will happen. From COP-22 to COP-100, we will talk about again promoting women. And yet we need really for women to shift from a consumer status to an agent of change.
I'm a bit struck by how big this question is and how potentially challenging that really is to do. And it's exactly that, because I too find myself quite, especially when it comes to the issue of we need the evidence and we need the data that makes it clear why, for example, women's rights, gender equality, and climate change are linked, or environment are linked. And it often can feel sometimes that the evidence is just overwhelming. And how long will we be having to showcase the evidence of something that seems just inherently common sense and so clear, as Rudy, you also said as well, in terms of why, when you're developing policies or programs or projects, you should have everyone part of that conversation to make sure it's meeting the needs of everyone. And so I think that there's a few things that I think need to shift. It is also the discussion of what solutions look like in this process, for example, and in the international community. I remember that when we were submitting solutions for the General Secretary Summit in 2014, for us, a lot of these solutions were very much to scale. They were working in local communities. They were working across regions. They really were projects that, whether it was local solar collectors or off-grid sites that could have used sustained investment. And, we're told that these projects were too small. They didn't provide the kind of transformational shift that's required right now. I think that's a potentially really unhelpful way of thinking if we're not able to think outside the box of what kinds of projects can be brought to scale at what level, but also what projects can be replicated across different communities and really invested in. And so I think that that's something that these kinds of partnerships become critical to showcase those solutions, to showcase how they can be brought to scale at different levels and how they can have women's rights at the core of what they're doing. And it's certainly something that the Women and Gender constituency is also trying to do. For the last 2 years, we've awarded gender-just climate solutions. We developed our own platform for showcasing what climate action looks like from a women's rights perspective. And so I think that that's the importance of this kind of partnership. I don't know that it'll create the shift that we're all challenged by. And I think there's a lot of larger issues at play that we need to be actively challenging in terms of our global system. But I do think that the role of these kinds of partnerships is critical.
Thank you. So Rudy, I'm told we don't have much time, but I'm certainly interested to hear what you have to say, seeing that you are in a partnership.
Yeah, this timing for this panel sucks.
Yeah.
It's like 6:30, everyone's starving, and
I
I'm
know.
answering the last question. But so I'll say three things. I think innovation, entrepreneurship, and education are the three things that are real barriers to seeing the growth. I think bringing women to the table is a really important part of it. It's very much a male-dominated sector, and I think that at a minimum needs to change. We need more female engineers, we need more female lawyers, we need more female bankers working in this space, because I think a lot of these decisions are being made without women. So I think that's the first thing. And I think I do want to say that I do think in the past 40 years things have changed. It's a slow burning cigarette kind of change. It's very, very slow, but it's changing. You know, I know, and I think that your pictures are so powerful because that is frighteningly slow. But I was in Kenya last year, and MCOPA took me out to see some of their customers, and they took me to this house, and you know, it was 3 women who were married to 1 man, which, you know, everyone has their own opinions about. But these 3 women had like ganged up on their one husband and basically convinced him to stop buying kerosene and to buy all 3 of them MCOPA solar units. And I was so intrigued by this. I was like, how did you guys, like, what was your strategy? How did you convince your husband, you know, your one husband to do this? And they basically had like drawn out for him how much he was spending on kerosene and how much he was spending, he could spend on this MCOPA home kit, and when they realized it was the same, it was like a no-brainer, and then they would have money later. And so they had a plan, and they bought furniture for each of their houses. I mean, they started buying beads to make jewelry. They had this whole plan that was so like surprising to me and so encouraging to me that I think changes there. It's super slow. It's too slow, and I think, you know, it's up to all of us to make sure that it goes faster. And I think innovation and entrepreneurship are keys to that. On the innovation scale side, I'll just say that Power Africa just launched a really exciting grand challenge for development in the off-grid space, which is looking for innovators and researchers to come together to the table and come up with new solutions for some of these very old problems. And on the entrepreneurship side, we also just launched small seed $100,000 grants that are exclusively focused at women, actually, and we've already awarded several of them in a co-ed competition. We just launched the female version of it. So I think change is slow, but change is coming.
Thank you very much, Rudy. So just really quickly, the technology that Rudy was talking about, MCOPA, is innovative, actually quite a market leader in Kenya. And it's a solar system that's a pay-as-you-go system. So it incorporates mobile money, and then you can get this amazing system with some lighting, and then you just pay, I think, just for the units as you go. So it's quite interesting. MCOPA, MKOPA. Okay, so I think we're running out of time, but I really do want to hear your thoughts and have you ask questions of our panelists.
So thank you, everybody, for coming to the U.S. Center. We do have a reception, which is where we're going to ask you to interact with our panelists and ask your questions, because unfortunately the food is over there and waiting. But it has been fantastic to hear all of the work that you're doing. I don't think any of us can doubt that a small group of motivated women can absolutely change the world based on what we've been hearing here today. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists and ask you all to please show your appreciation for the work that they're doing.
Thank you.
And as I said, we do have a reception following this event, so I'd ask you to please make your way over here and make sure to approach our panelists and ask your questions. Thank you again for coming to the U.S. Center. We hope you'll come back for additional events throughout the week and enjoy the rest of your time here in Marrakesh.